Welcome to today's deep dive, where we'll be exploring how the Bill of Rights came to apply to state governments.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating story.
It is.
One that really gets to the heart of American federalism and the balance of power between the federal government and the states.
Definitely. And it all starts with a case you might not be familiar with.
Right,
Barron v. Baltimore.
from 1833.
Now, this case might surprise you because for much of early American history, those first 10 amendments, the ones we consider so fundamental to our freedom.
The cornerstone of our liberties.
Exactly. They only applied to the federal government.
Yeah, imagine that. The states were pretty much left to their own devices when it came to those rights.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it from our modern perspective.
Absolutely. It really challenges our assumptions about how those rights have always been understood.
So let's set the stage for Barron v. Baltimore. We have John Barron, a successful wharf owner in Baltimore. His business is thriving until the city decides to undertake a construction project.
Oh, this sounds like trouble.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, construction projects and property rights often clash.
And that's exactly what happened. The city's project ended up diverting streams and causing sediment to build up around Barron's wharf.
I see the problem. That would make the water too shallow for ships to dock.
Exactly. And that basically destroyed his business.
Wow, that's devastating. Talk about government interference.
Barron was understandably furious. He decided to sue the city, arguing they had essentially taken his property without just compensation.
Makes sense. He was invoking the Fifth Amendment's takings clause.
Precisely.
Mm.
He argued that the city's actions violated that clause, which requires the government to provide just compensation when they take private property for public use.
So a pretty straightforward application of the Fifth Amendment, you would think.
You'd think so, right? But here's where things get really interesting. The Supreme Court, led by the legendary Chief Justice John Marshall, disagreed.
Oh, this is the turning point.
It is. Their decision in Barron v. Baltimore sent shockwaves through the legal system. They declared that the Bill of Rights only restricted the federal government, not the states.
So essentially, they said the Fifth Amendment didn't apply to Baltimore in this case.
Exactly.
Wow, that must have been a huge blow to Barron and to anyone who thought the Bill of Rights protected them from state actions.
It was a major setback, and it raised a lot of questions about the nature of individual rights in a federal system.
Right.
If the Founding Fathers were so concerned about limiting federal power, weren't they essentially giving states free rein to potentially violate those very rights?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of the debate over federalism.
How could they be so focused on limiting the federal government while seemingly overlooking the potential for state governments to infringe upon those same liberties?
Well, the prevailing thought at the time was that state constitutions would serve as the primary protectors of individual rights.
So they kind of assumed the states would handle it.
Yeah, and to be fair, many state constitutions did have similar, if not identical, protections to those found in the Bill of Rights.
But still, the potential for states to overstep those bounds had to be a concern.
Right, it wasn't a perfect system, and there were definitely instances where states did infringe upon individual liberty.
Think about a state deciding they wanted to establish a state religion, for example.
In theory, yes, under the Barron interpretation, that would have been possible.
It's a scary thought, isn't it?
It is, but it's important to remember that the reality on the ground was often more complex than just the legal interpretation.
Right, societal norms, political pressures, all of those things played a role in shaping how individual rights were actually protected.
Exactly. It wasn't just a black and white issue.
So we have this system where the Bill of Rights doesn't apply to the states, and then comes the Civil War and the seismic shifts that followed.
A pivotal moment in American history.
Absolutely. And it's during this period that we get the 14th Amendment in 1868.
14th Amendment. This is where things get really interesting.
It is. The 14th Amendment fundamentally changed the relationship between the federal government and the states.
And it opened the door to a whole new interpretation of the Bill of Rights.
The Privileges or Immunities Clause in particular seemed to offer a path towards applying those protections to state actions.
No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Powerful words.
Powerful indeed. So could this be the key to finally bringing those fundamental rights to the state level?
That was the hope of many legal scholars and activists at the time.
And one figure who championed this idea was Justice Hugo Black.
Oh, absolutely. Justice Black was a staunch advocate for incorporating the Bill of Rights into the 14th Amendment.
He believed that the privileges and immunities protected by that clause were essentially the same fundamental rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights.
It's a compelling argument when you look at similar language in other parts of the Constitution, like Article 4, for example.
Right. Article 4 uses that same phrase, privileges and immunities, to prevent states from discriminating against citizens of other states.
So Black's argument was if those privileges and immunities include fundamental rights in that context, why shouldn't they also include them in the context of the 14th Amendment?
His logic seems pretty sound. And we even have historical figures like Senator Jacob Howard and Representative John Bingham, both of whom were deeply involved in drafting the 14th Amendment.
Right, key players in the Reconstruction era.
They both explicitly stated that they saw the 14th Amendment as extending the Bill of Rights to the states.
Strong evidence in support of Black's interpretation.
So it seems like a pretty open and shut case, right? The language of the amendment supports it. Historical figures involved in its drafting confirm it.
Well, not so fast.
Oh.
Legal historians like Charles Fairman have presented a different perspective.
Really?
Fairman's research suggests that the historical context surrounding the 14th Amendment is more ambiguous than we might initially think.
So even with those statements from Howard and Bingham, there wasn't necessarily a universal understanding at the time that incorporating the Bill of Rights was the primary objective.
Exactly. It's a complex historical puzzle, and Fairman argues that the evidence doesn't point to a single definitive interpretation.
That makes you think, doesn't it? If even the people who wrote and ratified the 14th Amendment didn't have a clear and unified view of its purpose, how can we be so sure of its meaning today?
It's a fundamental question about constitutional interpretation. How much weight should we give to original intent versus evolving societal values?
It's a debate that continues to this day, and it raises some really profound questions about the nature of our legal system and how we interpret the Constitution.
Absolutely. It highlights the challenges of applying a document written centuries ago to the complexities of modern life.
So we have this intriguing possibility of applying the Bill of Rights to the states through the 14th Amendment's Privileges or Immunities Clause. But as we've seen, the historical record is murky at best.
And to make matters even more complicated, there was a major legal roadblock that emerged just a few years after the 14th Amendment was ratified.
You're talking about the slaughterhouse cases, right?
Exactly. Those cases dealt a significant blow to the idea of incorporating the Bill of Rights through the Privileges or Immunities Clause.
Okay, well, we'll have to dive into those cases and see how they reshaped the legal landscape in our next deep dive.
I think you'll find it to be a fascinating turning point in this story.
I'm sure I will.
Yeah.
Stay tuned, folks, because this journey is just getting started. The slaughterhouse cases, you say. Those sound pretty dramatic.
They were a pivotal moment in this whole debate over the Bill of Rights and its reach.
So what happened? What were these cases all about?
Well, picture New Orleans in the late 1860s. The city was grappling with sanitation problems, especially in the meatpacking industry.
Okay, I can imagine it wasn't a pretty sight.
Not exactly. To address this issue, the state legislature decided to create a monopoly.
Monopoly? How did that work?
They granted one company exclusive rights to slaughter livestock within city limits.
So all the butchers in New Orleans had to use this one company's facilities.
That's right. It was an attempt to centralize the industry and improve sanitation standards.
But I bet that didn't sit well with everyone.
You're right. It created quite a stir. Many butchers felt like this monopoly was a violation of their right to earn a living.
Yeah, I can see how they'd be upset. Their livelihoods were at stake.
Absolutely. They argued that this monopoly infringed upon their privileges and immunities as citizens protected by the 14th Amendment.
Ah, so they saw this as a test case for the 14th Amendment's power to protect individual rights against state action.
Exactly. They were hoping for a broad interpretation of the Privileges or Immunities Clause, one that would strike down this monopoly and affirm their right to pursue their chosen profession.
So basically their Barron v. Baltimore moment.
Yeah, in a way, they were challenging the state's authority and asking the Supreme Court to step in and protect their rights.
This is getting good. So what happened? Did the court side with the butchers?
Well, in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Louisiana.
Oh, wow. So they upheld the monopoly.
Why they did. And their reasoning was quite significant.
Okay, I'm all ears. This is where things get really interesting.
The court essentially interpreted the Privileges or Immunities Clause very narrowly. They said it only applied to rights that stem specifically from federal citizenship.
So like the right to travel freely between states or to access seaports,
Exactly. Those kinds of rights that are directly related to being a citizen of the United States as a whole.
but not the right to earn a living or to be free from state-sanctioned monopolies.
According to the court's interpretation in this case, no.
So even though the 14th Amendment was intended to protect individual rights from state infringement, the slaughterhouse cases put some pretty strict limits on what those rights actually entail.
Right. It wasn't the sweeping victory that many proponents of the 14th Amendment had hoped for.
I imagine this decision caused quite a backlash.
It did. It was a major setback for those who were advocating for a broader application of the Bill of Rights to the states.
So wait, after all that anticipation, after the Civil War and the passage of the 14th Amendment, the court basically said, nope, the Privileges or Immunities Clause doesn't really do what you thought it did.
In essence, yes.
It seems like a bit of a bait and switch, doesn't it?
It's certainly a controversial decision and one that has been debated by legal scholars ever since.
I mean, if the Bill of Rights was meant to safeguard fundamental liberties from government overreach, and the 14th Amendment was supposed to extend those liberties to all citizens, how can we reconcile this narrow interpretation with the spirit of both amendments?
That's a question that has haunted legal thinkers for over a century.
It seems like a fundamental contradiction.
It gets to the heart of the debate over federalism and the balance of power between the federal government and the states.
Some might argue that this narrow interpretation of the Privileges or Immunities Clause undermines the whole purpose of the 14th Amendment.
Right, while others might say that it represents a necessary balance between protecting individual rights and preserving the autonomy of states to govern within their own spheres.
It's a debate that continues to this day, isn't it? We see it play out in contemporary controversies over things like gun control, abortion rights, religious freedom, all these issues where the question of federal versus state power is front and center.
Absolutely. The slaughterhouse cases didn't settle the debate, they just shifted the battleground.
So if the Privileges or Immunities Clause wasn't the path to incorporating the Bill of Rights, what happened next? Did the idea just fade away?
Not at all. Legal minds are resourceful, and they started exploring alternative avenues within the 14th Amendment.
Oh, like what?
There was another clause that began to attract attention, the Due Process Clause.
Ah, yes, due process. That sounds familiar. Refresh my memory. What exactly does that clause guarantee?
The Due Process Clause states that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
So it's basically a procedural safeguard right. It ensures that the government has to follow certain rules and procedures before they can take away someone's life, liberty, or property.
That's the traditional understanding. But legal scholars began to argue that the Due Process Clause also had a substantive dimension.
Substantive dimension, what does that mean?
They argued that certain rights are so fundamental, so essential to the very concept of liberty, that depriving someone of those rights, even with due process, would inherently violate the 14th Amendment.
So they were saying the due process isn't just about the process itself, but also about the substance of the rights being protected.
Exactly. It's a subtle but incredibly important distinction.
So even though the Privileges or Immunities Clause had been dealt a blow in the slaughterhouse cases, the Due Process Clause offered a new legal argument, a new path toward applying the Bill of Rights to the states.
Exactly. It became a way to argue that certain rights were so fundamental that they couldn't be infringed upon by the states regardless of the process used.
That's fascinating.
Oh,
So instead of arguing for wholesale incorporation of the entire Bill of Rights, they started focusing on specific rights, demonstrating how essential they were to the very essence of liberty.
Precisely. They had to build their case right by right, showing how each one was so fundamental that it deserved protection from state infringement.
Okay, so which rights did they target first? What were the early victories in this new battle for incorporation?
One of the most significant early examples was freedom of speech.
Ah, yes, freedom of speech, the cornerstone of a free society.
Absolutely. And in the 1925 case of Gitlow v. New York, the Supreme Court took a major step towards incorporating this right through the 14th Amendment.
So tell me about Gitlow. What happened there?
Well, Benjamin Gitlow was a socialist who had published a left-wing manifesto advocating for revolution.
Sounds a bit radical.
It was considered quite inflammatory at the time. He was arrested and convicted under a New York law that prohibited advocating for the overthrow of the government.
Okay, so the state was trying to restrict his speech based on its content.
Exactly. But Gitlow appealed his conviction, arguing that the First Amendment's protection of free speech should apply to the states through the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause.
So this was a direct challenge to New York's law and to the traditional understanding that the Bill of Rights only limited the federal government.
It was a bold move, and one that had the potential to reshape the legal landscape.
So what did the Supreme Court decide? Did they side with Gitlow?
In a 7-2 decision, the court upheld Gitlow's conviction.
Oh, so he lost.
He did, but there was a crucial twist in the court's reasoning.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting. I'm sensing a but coming.
You got it. The court acknowledged for the first time that freedom of speech is indeed a fundamental liberty protected from state infringement through the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause.
So even though they upheld his conviction, they agreed with his argument in principle.
Exactly. It was a significant victory for free speech advocates, even though Gitlow himself didn't benefit from it directly.
Wow, what a fascinating outcome. So Gitlow lost his case, but in losing, he helped establish a precedent that would have far-reaching implications.
Precisely. It opened the door to incorporating other fundamental rights through the Due Process Clause.
So it's like that old saying, one step back, two steps forward.
Yeah, you could see it that way. It was a turning point in the fight to extend the Bill of Rights to the states.
Okay, so after Gitlow, did they start incorporating other rights using this same due process rationale?
They did. It became a gradual process known as selective incorporation, where the court would consider each right on a case-by-case basis.
So they were picking and choosing which rights to incorporate.
In a sense, yes. They were looking for those rights that they deemed most fundamental to the concept of liberty.
Okay, I'm curious. What were some of the other key rights that they incorporated through this process?
Well, another landmark case was Powell v. Alabama in 1932. This case involved the right to counsel in capital cases.
So for people facing the death penalty.
Exactly. The court ruled that in these cases, states were required to provide legal representation to defendants who couldn't afford it.
Wow, that's a huge deal.
Yeah.
It recognizes the fundamental right to a fair trial, even for those accused of the most serious crimes.
Absolutely. It ensures that even the most vulnerable defendants have a chance to defend themselves against the power of the state.
And what about other rights? Did they incorporate any of the other amendments through the Due Process Clause?
Oh, yes. Over the years, the court selectively incorporated many other crucial rights. For example, in Mapp v. Ohio in 1961, they incorporated the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures.
Oh, right. Mapp v. Ohio.
Yeah.
That's a famous one. It set limits on what law enforcement could do when gathering evidence, right?
Exactly. It established the exclusionary rule, which prohibits the use of illegally obtained evidence in state criminal trials.
So even if the police find something incriminating during an illegal search, they can't use it against the defendant in court.
That's the idea. It's a powerful deterrent against police misconduct and a way to protect individual privacy from unreasonable government intrusion.
Mapp is a great example of how this incorporation doctrine has had real, practical implications for people's lives.
Absolutely. It's not just an abstract legal theory. It has tangible effects on how the criminal justice system operates at the state level.
So it seems like this selective incorporation approach has been quite successful in extending the Bill of Rights to the states. But I'm guessing it wasn't without its critics?
Oh, you're absolutely right. This piecemeal approach sparked a lot of debate. Some argued that it gave the federal judiciary too much power over the states.
So they saw it as a threat to federalism.
Exactly. They argued that it undermined the autonomy of states to experiment with different approaches to governance, and that it risked imposing a uniform set of values on a diverse nation.
Right, laboratories of democracy and all that.
Precisely. It's a classic tension in American politics, the balance between federal power and states' rights.
It's interesting to see how this debate has played out over time. We started with a resounding no in Barron v. Baltimore, and then gradually moved towards a yes through this process of selective incorporation.
And that debate is still ongoing today.
What are some of the key arguments on both sides of this issue? Why does this matter for us in the 21st century?
Okay, so we've seen how the Supreme Court used the Due Process Clause to incorporate some of the Bill of Rights, but how has that actually played out in real life?
Let's look at a case we mentioned earlier, Neer v. Minnesota from 1931.
Okay, Neer v. Minnesota.
This case really shows how incorporating freedom of the press had a tangible impact.
Remind me about this one, what happened in Neer?
So you have J. Neer, a journalist, who published a newspaper in Minneapolis.
Okay.
And his newspaper was let's just say it was pretty controversial.
Controversial how?
Well, he accused local officials of all sorts of things, corruption, ties to organized crime, you name it.
Wow, sounds like he was really stirring the pot.
He was.
Huh?
And Minnesota at the time had a law that allowed for the suppression of publications deemed a public nuisance.
Public nuisance. That seems pretty vague.
It was. And they used this law to try and shut down Near's paper.
So they were basically censoring him. Essentially, yes. They were trying to prevent him from publishing in the first place.
But isn't that a violation of freedom of the press?
Exactly. It's what's known as prior restraint, and it's generally considered a big no-no when it comes to freedom of speech.
Right. You can't just silence someone before they've even had a chance to speak.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in Near v. Minnesota, the Supreme Court stepped in and said, hold on, Minnesota, you can't do that.
So even though Near's paper was inflammatory, they recognized that shutting it down beforehand violated the First Amendment.
Precisely. They affirmed that freedom of the press, even when it's messy or irresponsible, is a fundamental right, and it's protected by the 14th Amendment.
This Near case is a great example of how these abstract legal principles have real-world consequences.
Absolutely. It shows how incorporating the Bill of Rights can protect individuals from government overreach at the state level.
It also highlights the crucial role of a free press in a democracy.
Right, free press is essential for holding those in power accountable and for informing the public.
Okay, so we've talked about freedom of the press. What about other areas? How has incorporation impacted criminal justice, for example?
Well, let's look at Mapp v. Ohio, a landmark case from 1961.
Okay, Mapp v. Ohio. I remember we touched on this one earlier.
This case really illustrates how incorporation has shaped the way law enforcement operates.
Remind me again, what was Mapp about?
So Dolly Mapp was suspected of harboring a fugitive,
Okay.
and the police went to her home without a warrant and searched it.
Without a warrant. Isn't that illegal?
It is. They violated her Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable searches and seizures.
And what did they find?
Well, they didn't find the fugitive, but they did find some materials that were considered obscene under Ohio law at the time.
So we were looking for one thing and stumbled upon something else entirely.
Right. And the question was, could this evidence obtained through an illegal search be used against her in court?
Seems like a clear-cut violation of the rights.
You'd think so, but before Mapp, the rules around illegally obtained evidence were kind of murky. Some states allowed it, others didn't. There wasn't a clear national standard.
So Mapp had the potential to change all that.
It did. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that any evidence obtained in violation of the Fourth Amendment is inadmissible in a state criminal trial.
Wow. So even though they found something incriminating, they couldn't use it against her because they got it illegally.
Exactly. That's what's known as the exclusionary rule.
And this rule applies to all states now.
Yes. Thanks to Mapp v. Ohio, it's a national standard.
That's a huge win for the protection of individual rights.
It is. It ensures that law enforcement can't just disregard the Constitution when gathering evidence.
Mapp shows how incorporating the Bill of Rights has placed real limits on state power.
It's a crucial safeguard against government overreach, and it protects us all from unwarranted intrusions into our lives.
It's been fascinating to trace this evolution from Barron v. Baltimore, where the court said the Bill of Rights didn't apply to the states, all the way to cases like Near and Mapp, where we see those same rights being actively enforced at the state level.
It's a testament to the enduring power of these principles and to the ongoing struggle to protect individual liberties.
And it's clear that this debate is far from over. The tension between federal power and states' rights continues to shape our legal and political landscape.
Absolutely. It's a dynamic tension and one that we need to keep engaging with.
This deep dive has really shed light on the complexity of these issues and the importance of understanding our rights and how they're protected.
It's been a pleasure exploring this with you.
Likewise, thanks for joining us, folks. And until next time, keep those critical thinking caps on and never stop questioning the world around you.